Good evening, students of British and American culture. We are back again after only one day. This week is a busy one for this class because of the makeup. So we are now moving into part 2 of our 19th century American lectures. Now, I think this is one of the lectures that I'm most uncomfortable with, probably because I'm not American. And a lot of the things that happen in the middle of the 19th century, the American Civil War, and other things, the tension and the cultural investment and the strong feelings that the political feelings and the racial, tension and the cultural, development of the different parts of America, it's very complicated. And I never learned about it in detail until I started teaching this course. And I realized I had to talk about it. Originally, when I taught this course, I think the first time I taught this was 4 years ago now, almost 5 years ago. I had no textbook, and I was offered the class, and I jumped at it because the British part in particular attracted me, but I'm very familiar with American culture too because, I've been there at least 20 times over my life, and I have literally hundreds of American friends and acquaintances. So, and Canada's so heavily influenced by American culture. So, I was really confident, or I was more confident in the British cultural aspect to this class, but now it needs to be here because it's so fundamental to a lot of the ways that it's still meaningful, even though it's an event that happened more than 150 years ago now, that the American Civil War is such a significant event in American history. So although in the textbook there is very little about what goes on, there's literally only 3 or 4 pages. That is not, it's disproportionate, it's too little. So that this is the second edition, improvements were made. So I hope that I get to do a third edition and I get to add more content in certain places. This is one of the places where a lot of material is lacking. I don't talk about Charles Dickens or Queen Victoria very much in this class, and that's a whole. And Mark Twain and the literature of the formative literature that creates this thing called American literature. It was already there, but it really expands and diversifies the different types of American literature you can read, and they create entire new types of literature. And I studied this in university, and I didn't include it, and I would like to. So I won't get into that because that's going to be added in subsequent years if I continue teaching this class. So for now, the object is really to just give you one lecture that hits the important points of the Civil War, and it's really going to be sort of a light touch because it is very complex, and as soon as I start adding names and events, I'm going to lose you. I think you're going to not be interested. So we're just going to focus on the big picture and the main points, as we have done over this entire course so far. I always like to come back to the point, that this is an introduction, in a sense, to British and American culture. So if you're interested in this material and you want to study a certain part of it, you should take what you learn here and add to it and look at it more closely and find out the information yourself, or take a course. There's lots of courses in different offered by different professors, especially in the English department, that deal with smaller periods, especially the literary aspect, but you can study it in the history department My hobby is history, and so I took history courses in university as well, just as electives, not as my major. So anyway, again, this is not a history course, it's a cultural studies course. So I'm going to jump around a lot. We are talking about chapter 6, but going back to earlier in the textbook, all the way back to chapter 4. At the end of chapter 4, there's a section on page 121 that talks about the after effects of the American Revolution, and then it talks about slavery. And this is a central issue that we have to deal with today that we haven't talked about. So there is that you need to read those pages. If you didn't read them and you're like, oh, Professor Sullivan didn't talk about that in week 6 or week 7, you do need to know because it's such a significant thing. So we're going to talk about that this lecture. The next lecture is going to be about after the war, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to add to the information I've already really, in very little detail, that I've given you. Sorry, my microphone's making noises. I've given you just a little bit of information, just a small slice of information about the Native people. And so in the third part of this week's lectures, I will talk about after the Civil War, moving us up into the 19th century, to the end of the 19th century. And I'll talk about the Native people. And today we're going to talk about the Civil War and the issue of slavery, right? So I should have put bookmarks in this because I'm going to jump around a lot. So let's get down to business here. The American Civil War, it's a 4.5 years. Like it's about. I mean, it covers a period of 5 years in the middle of the middle of the 19th century, and it basically divides the century in half. So you have the antebellum period, which means antebellum means before. Ante means before, and bellum means war. So the before war period, antebellum period, that's any American scholar or somebody who's familiar with the time period, that's what they call it. So we talked about that briefly already. And then there's the war itself, the Civil War, that it doesn't, just like other wars, there's sort of like a build-up. We talked about the Revolutionary War, how there was, there was all this protesting, and there were pamphlets going around, and the Boston Tea Party and everything, and that was all before the war. So there was a 10 years of build-up before the actual American Revolutionary War broke out in 1776. And things started happening, violent things started happening in 1775. But the actual war is dated 1776 until 1783, even though in 1783 nothing was really happening. So it's a similar thing. The actual fighting is happening during this, but the political tension and the cultural tension and the fighting between the different factions, the North and the South primarily, but there are different groups within the North and the South too that are arguing against each other. They are fighting for a long time, more than 10 years before. And also you can look at the English Civil War that we talked about. Everybody was angry. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of parliamentarians and Protestant people were angry at King Charles I for a long time before they actually started the English Civil War. There was a good 10 years, the period which they call the personal rule, where he just sent Parliament home, and he didn't call the Parliament until he completely ran out of money, and he had to call them back. In those 10 years, people were just getting angrier and angrier. So let's talk about this first. Why does the American Civil War begin in the first place? Well, there are some basic differences. Still, there are basic differences between the culture of the northern United States and the southern United States. But the differences back then were even more dramatic. They were more drastic. There is a book that I used a lot in preparing for this class, and I'm not sure where it is. I should have pulled it out. But it's called The Nations of the United States, and the book is written. American Nations is the name of the book, and in the book, the author describes about 10 different North American cultures that are distinct, and the Deep South is one of them, and the Northeast is another, and New York itself is a different one, because as I said to you before, when we started talking about America, some students, one particular student asked me about the idea of freedom in the United States, and as I said, the idea of freedom is quite complicated, because some Americans believe that freedom involves the freedom to not be free, and the Puritans are like, they have that sort of idea, is that there are rules to freedom. And then there are other people in the United States that think freedom is all the time. Like, you can just do whatever you want. And those people, I mean, if they don't believe in government, you would call them anarchists. And if they believe in government, but they think the government should really let private, interest govern everything, except for the very basic machinery of government, those people are called libertarians. And they're conservative, but they're a certain type of conservative that has an extreme sort of radical position. And the Puritans are radical too. But we look at the Puritans when they relaxed themselves, they became New England. They became, in a lot of ways, they're still the most influential group of people in North America. And but that was not always the case, because Virginia originally was where George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the first 5 presidents were all from Virginia, and Virginia was the first colony, with Jamestown, and it was named after Queen Elizabeth. And the wealthy people came over and they started growing tobacco, and they became wealthier and wealthier, and then they started importing slaves. And so Virginia became the most important state, the wealthiest, the largest, most important state. But as the country started to industrialize, which we talked about in the makeup lecture yesterday, as industrial machinery started to be developed in the North, the power shifted away from Virginia, and the wealth started to become, the wealth obviously started to be transferred, and the power along with it transferred into the hands of these industrialists, these people that owned the factories and had the money to increase production and to transport things and to develop new technologies. This is the way the world is going. But the South, in a way, has sort of not evolved as the North did. So the North was already a little bit different in just its cultural environment. The demographics certainly were different. It's partly because the North was composed of farmers who were normally, they were what you call yeoman farmers, and yeoman farmers are independent farmers. The expression is from England. It's British. It's a British thing, but it just means that you own your own farm and you have a family, and you grow your crops and you raise your livestock and you sell what you produce, and then you reap the benefits, right? And you don't. You might, if you're doing really well, you might employ other people as hired hands. You would pay other people. They might be indentured servants that were coming from Europe, so they had a certain term, like 7 years of work, and that's what they did in the South originally too. But they found increasingly that in the South, one of the factors, of course, is they're growing different things. You can't plant sugar in Pennsylvania, and you can't, in Massachusetts, you can't grow tobacco. So these certain types of crops lent themselves to rich people who had huge amounts of land and needed a lot of people to work in order to produce enough of these cash crops, essentially what they are: cotton, tobacco, and sugar. To a certain extent, rice and indigo are other products too in the Carolinas. Sugar actually is, I shouldn't say sugar too much, because sugar is really down in the islands. It grows better in Cuba and Jamaica and what is now Haiti, but was called Saint-Domingue back then. So sugars is more of an island product, and so is coffee. But in the southern United States, cotton and tobacco are huge. And if you have a lot of money, you could afford to hire whoever came over. And the people that came over originally were mostly criminals, what do they call vagrants, vagabonds, people that had no jobs back in Europe, in England, and they basically sometimes they just kidnapped them. They could be, drunk or poor or out of work or, sort of, what can you say, like wanderers. They're that's what a vagabond is essentially. Like they have no family, no attachments, whatever. They take these people, they could be criminals, prisoners, or they could have been criminals who were about to be released, but they had a criminal record, whatever. They throw them on the boats and they take them over, and they are required to work a certain term, like 7 years is typical in Virginia. And after 7 years, they're free. They also make this deal that if you come over, even if you're not, guilty of anything, you're just a poor person who wants a chance to start a new life. If you come over and you work for 7 years and you complete your work, then you get some free land. This all happened back when King James was running things, and back in the 17th century. This is what the deal was. But after a while, they started to run out of land, and the native people didn't really want more people just grabbing all of their land, so they started to become more aggressive. So the whole situation changed. Most of the good land was gone, and they didn't really have the labor. There wasn't really a draw as much as there was during the English Civil War, during the Restoration, and all the complicated, unstable environment that happened from the death of King James to, the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So there was about 60 years there that people left for religious reasons and because they were poor or they're escaping political, people isolating them or ostracizing them for their political alignment or their religious beliefs. There's all kinds of reasons that a lot of English settlers just decided to leave England and take a chance. Irish people came over and Scottish people came over too soon after them. So, but that amount of people that came across was not sufficient. The Europeans tended to get sick easier. There was lots of diseases in the southern United States that were much more dangerous in that climate, in the warmer climate, than in Massachusetts. They just wouldn't be affected by malaria, for example, or fevers or flus and stuff like that, the way that they were affected by them in the South. So the fact that these people would get sick and die after they came was a big deterrent, both for the person who was working and for the employer. Native people also tended not to be very good slaves or not be very good workers. Their entire culture revolved around an entirely different way of life. And you couldn't take, certainly, if you took a native person prisoner and you put them on a plantation and made them work 12 hours a day in a field and live in a house and lay on a wooden bed, that was not their lifestyle, and that would make them incredibly depressed and, in many cases, suicidal or aggressive. They would try to run away, they would try to kill you, or they would try to kill themselves. I can understand that. I think you probably could too. If you were kidnapped from your family and your home and a natural environment that you had been used to your entire life, and even if you were young and you had a lot of life left, you just wouldn't want. You would think the point of living was gone. So, in contrast to that, in contrast to the European labor pool and the native labor pool, which were very unreliable because of disease, because of culture, because of their, I guess there was a combination of different factors that made them less attractive to work in those fields than the people from West Africa. And they created this thing called the slave triangle, essentially where boats from England and Western Europe, whether it was France or Portugal or Spain or England or the Dutch, they would bring finished tools and goods, including weapons like guns, down to West Africa. They would trade them. They would capture slaves in some cases, but usually what they would do is just trade with any local chieftain or king in Africa, whoever was had the advantage, the local advantage, the regional advantage in West Africa. They would arrive there with all these goods that the Africans wanted, and they would trade them for slaves. So whichever tribe was winning the wars and taking prisoners would trade their prisoners for the finished goods that they desired, to give them even more. It was a kind of a vicious cycle. It was a snowball effect where once one tribe took over another tribe and sold them into slavery, then they got weapons that made them even stronger, and they got metal, and they got equipment and food and tools and all kinds of things that the Europeans could give them that gave them an even further advantage, which allowed them to get more prisoners and expand their influence. So this would continue for hundreds of years, where basically the Europeans were taking advantage of certain groups of people in Africa and taking the people from other groups, transporting them to America. And the Spanish and the Portuguese moved close to 10 million people, and the English and the French several million as well. It's one of the biggest forced relocations of human beings in the history of humankind, and it would be, by any stretch of the imagination, it would be considered a war crime or a crime against humanity. There's no question. It may be the worst war crime, or not. I shouldn't call it war crime. It was related to war in some cases, but crime against humanity. It's one of the worst things that human beings have done to other human beings, is displacing people from Africa. So they displaced them, and then they arrived, and many of them died because it was horrible conditions. They put as many people in the boats as they could, and I guess in a sense, obviously, the healthiest, strongest of the African people that were transported survived. So you ended up with a superior, gene pool when they arrived. Plus, they were from areas in Africa that had some of these diseases, and they were used to a warmer climate, and so they tended to survive longer. And for whatever reason, maybe it's a cultural thing, that they were more likely to be reliable. And they rebelled, and some of them attacked their masters, and as they should have. But there was a lot of intimidation and control, and there was a lot of education. Some of them were raised from when they were young to behave a certain way, and you can imagine how a lot of Americans invested heavily in this because they needed these people to work. George Washington had several hundred slaves, and Thomas Jefferson had about 100 himself, around 80, I guess. And those are the founding fathers, and they're pretty hypocritical for creating a country that they think is based on freedom, while they have hundreds of people chained to their work while they're fighting for freedom against the British Empire. It's a bit hypocritical, and as I told you, that is one of the biggest contradictions and in American history. It's the attitude they have towards not just African Americans, but the racial tension in America is a contradiction, because America's supposedly supposed to be about you having the opportunity, and it's about equality and human rights, and it's a place where anybody can achieve something and be free. But it's not true. It's right in the beginning, right from the very start, it was sort of a twisted version of reality. So this is the main thing that causes the Civil War, right, is the slavery thing. Contrary to what most people believe, and myself included when I was in high school learning about this, it's not really that the North was trying to take away slavery from the South. That's what I always thought, is that, later everybody's like, oh, the main issue was emancipation. The main issue was freeing the slaves. But that was not actually the case. There was lots of people in the North that, by our standards today, you would say are extremely racist. They didn't think that, they believed in segregation. They just didn't think that slavery should be an institution that should be relied upon as a fundamental part of the development of the United States. So essentially they thought that slavery could exist in the South as long as it stayed there. That this is most people's opinion, is that, there's another opinion. There's a wide range of opinions, and Abraham Lincoln is the most famous figure in this, because he did believe that essentially the black people should all be free, and he did believe that, but he didn't really push that agenda because he couldn't. Because most Americans didn't think that. There was definitely some radical Republicans that did believe that all black people should be freed right now. And it's not about economics. It's not about, politics. It's about morality. Is that human beings should not be slaves, and we should not be, and if we have slaves, it shouldn't only be black people. It should just be, slavery shouldn't exist at all, right? It shouldn't be, and if we do have slaves, there should be white slaves too, but there's not. So what's going on here? There's those people, but they're on the extreme edge, and most people are somewhere in the middle, which is hard for us to understand. It's hard for me to understand that people would have this range of opinions, but this is what was the case. So you have all these people in the middle who are like, no, we shouldn't have slavery, but we should have segregation. Black people should go to one school and white people should go to another school, and we should have different restaurants and different bathrooms. That, in the 1960s, is what needs to be corrected, because it never gets corrected, because a lot of people still believed in it. Even though they didn't want black people to be slaves, they didn't want them to mix. And that is racist too. So you've basically got, honestly, it's something like 90%, I'm going to say, 80-90% of America is racist. It's just degrees of racism. So, and this is partly because education-wise, there's this, it's partly related to imperialism. There's this idea that races are fundamentally different, and they have different personalities, and they have different strengths and weaknesses and all this kind of stuff. We know it's all pseudoscience. It's all made up stuff. But when Charles Darwin goes around the world shortly, later, and he discovers the variation and the evolution of different types of birds, then human beings start saying ridiculous things like, oh, well, human beings have the same kind of thing. This human being is good, this type of human being is good at this, and this one's good at another. But it's not. That's not how it works. It's clear that human beings are not that diversified, and we haven't lived on separate islands like Darwin's finches for long enough for us to evolve into these specialized human beings that certain people are good at math, and certain people are good at jumping, and certain people are faster or slower. There's other reasons for those things that are not genetically based. So all these factors play into the fact that basically the South is hanging on to the idea of slavery because they have to. Their economy and their culture, their society, all these things along the bottom. Their political system, their military, everything revolves around slavery. And what happens is Napoleon decides to sell this gigantic piece of land that's just the biggest, even bigger than Alaska, because later the United States will buy Alaska too. But Louisiana is like the whole middle part of the United States. Napoleon needs money, and he gets this territory from Spain. So he just sells it to, Thomas Jefferson. And they buy it, and then it's empty. But Americans start moving out there, and then they have the Mexican War, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, because we're going to talk about Paul Bunyan and Davy Crockett. And Davy Crockett fights in the American-Mexican War, the Mexican-American War. And so the expansion westward, like I have here, the westward expansion, all of a sudden the United States kind of just, there's a kind of a hard border. On the edge of the mountains, there's natives, and there's French, and there's Spanish, but there's not that many of them. And when Jefferson buys that land and the territory opens up, there's just, at first there's just a trickle of people, but then soon there's things that, cause people to run in droves that direction. There's this, shortage of land and an opportunity in the east, and then there's gold found in the Black Hills in Dakota. This is later, but the gold rush and everything, all these things, and they take possession of Texas. All these things happen leading up or after. This all happens in the 19th century, where the gates are open, and then at first it's just a few people being risky and adventurous, but all of a sudden the floodgates open, and everybody's going west. And the question is, are the new territories and the new states that open up, when they join the United States, are they going to be slave states, or are they going to be free states? And that's a lot of the fighting revolves around that. And the fact that the North is industrializing, and the population in the North is going up, and in the South, the population of African Americans, the black people, is outnumbering the white people. All of this sort of creates a paranoia. It creates a fear amongst the politicians and the wealthy and the people who have the reins, the power in the South. They're all concerned that if we don't expand the franchise of slavery to the new states, that the North will just eventually have more people. They already have 50% more people, so that's not really it's already a concern. So they're trying to balance out the power of the North, because they're afraid that they're going to have less representation based on their population and their territory. And so the North is going to have all the political control and the power over them, and they're going to take away the state rights. And that's how they frame it. They say, it's not about slavery, it's about our sovereignty. It's about, just like the other things we discussed, the English Civil War, Parliament wanted to be sovereign. And in the Revolutionary War, the colonies want to be sovereign. And in this case, the South wants to be sovereign. They don't want to be controlled by a federal government, by a national government that is controlled by people in the North, because they have a different culture, they have a different economic system, they have a different political representation, because the Republicans control the North and the Democrats control the South. I know this is extremely confusing if you follow politics, because now it's reversed. The Republicans are conservative, and they're more likely to be racist, and they represent the people in the less populated, less urbanized area. But in Abraham Lincoln's time, it was the opposite. New York, Boston, in the Northeast, and all the developed, industrialized urban areas, they were Republican. So I know this is super confusing, but Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but he has more in common with Barack Obama and the Democrats than he does with Donald Trump and the Republicans, because they flipped. And that occurs much later. So anyway, the North is Republican, the South is Democrat. The politics are different. The military system is different too, because in the North, I mean, you can serve in the military no matter, as the war gets going, no matter who you are. In the South, essentially, they're afraid to give guns and weapons to black people because they're afraid they're going to use them against them. So there's all this racial tension involved in what's going on in the South. So they're trying to make the slaves do the work on the farms and in the factories, and the white people are the ones who do the fighting. The demographics are completely different too, because the majority of people in the South are actually black, and the minority is the white, but they're the ones who have all the power. In the North, there are black people, of course, but most of them are free. And many of the states have already, from the 1780s and the 1800s, they have already, state by state, declared that their slavery is illegal. So now it's up to the federal government to force the states in the South to comply to what individual states have done in the North already. But that's not going to happen until partway through the war. So in the beginning, it's really about, are the new territories going to be slave states or free states? And it turns out that what's happening in terms of the division of territories and the population growth and the expectations are not good enough. So when the politicians move towards these limitations for expansion of slavery and try to contain it, as soon as that happens, that the South feels like they're penned in and their slavery cannot expand any further, then they go to war. And they start it. And that's Abraham Lincoln's part of his genius, is he waited for the Confederates to attack him first. So even the people who were really not anti-slavery supported Lincoln, because the Confederates started the war. It's not the North being aggressive, it's the South being aggressive. So therefore, what we're really doing, slavery is not really the main point at the beginning for Lincoln. The main point is we have to keep the country together. These people are rebels, they're doing something illegal, and we have to force them to follow the the rules of the country. And if it takes a war and killing thousands and hundreds of thousands of people to do that, then that's what we have to do. And there are lots of people who are not really supportive of slavery and don't really care about that issue one way or another, but they do believe in the United States. And they do believe that the people who are rebelling and fighting to secede from the United States, that they are wrong and they need to be punished. So on one side, you have Abraham Lincoln, and on the other side, and he's in the northern states call themselves the Union, because their purpose is to unify and to make a union of the North and the South. And the Confederacy is the group of states that create a new country temporarily, because they lose, and they're led by Jefferson Davis. The main general on the Confederate side is named Robert E. Lee, and I'm not going to talk about him in detail, so I'm just mentioning him because he's very famous as a brave, honorable, and talented Confederate general. And on the other side, Ulysses S. Grant ends up being the supreme commander, in the 3-star general, which later becomes 4 stars in late subsequent wars. But he becomes the supreme commander for Abraham Lincoln, and he ends up ultimately winning the war and meeting Robert E. Lee, who finally surrenders in 1865. So the consequences of this are pretty serious. You have to read about it in more detail because I don't want to make this video extremely long. It's probably long enough already. I haven't been watching the clock. But essentially, now you know what led up to the war, you know the results of the war, and you know the differences between the South and the North. So I want you to remember these details, and I certainly want you to remember to read both 121 to 126. That's at the end of chapter 4. So you have to rewind, go to chapter 4 and read those pages. That's 6 pages there, which talks about slavery, and it talks about the after effects of the American Revolution. And then you have to jump forward to chapter 6, and you do have to skip a little until you get to 159, and you need to read about the war between the states, and it gives you more detail. It talks about Tecumseh Sherman and what happens, you know, how they win, and it ends, it's very short. It's from 159 to 162, and that's just a summary of what happens during it. The period after, basically the South becomes a defeated country, so they're occupied for about, I mean, most states, they withdraw them fairly quickly, but some of the states have Northern Union soldiers garrisoned there to make sure they're behaving for about 10 years after the war is over. And they finally withdraw them. They attempt to rehabilitate, and the key word is reconstruct. It's called the Reconstruction era because not only does it have to be physically rebuilt in the South, but they're trying to change their culture so that black people can participate in and have a political life, and an individual can be normal citizens and lay claim to the same kind of rights that they should have across the entire. They believe they should promote equality, like it says in the Constitution, and that's why the 14th and 15th Amendment passed through Congress, is to try and protect those people. But unfortunately, they fail, and for close to 100 years, because it's in the 1960s that Martin Luther participates in the civil rights movement, that they still haven't gotten rid of segregation, and that African Americans are still disadvantaged to this day. It still hasn't been fixed. So the consequences of this are important. For the, you know, if you go to the United States, you should be aware of the context that causes these situations for different types of people, and that being aware of it can help us come up with a solution and correct some of the things that have never really been addressed. So that's why this lecture is so complicated, and why it takes a lot of effort to communicate it effectively to the students, because Korea, it doesn't have this kind of history where there's multiple ethnic groups and one is subjected to the other for hundreds of years. Irish people can understand this quite well. People who are living in a country where they're a minority can understand this very well, but Korean students, fortunately for them, your grandparents and your great-grandparents would understand, though, because during the Japanese occupation, similar types of behavior, rules, laws, and cultural attempts to alter culture and change people's behavior and control people, those were implemented, and those policies are very they're remembered very, very keenly by the people that still. Everybody knows about it because the education system in Korea is well developed. Sometimes these things don't get addressed because, for various reasons, the education system tries to diminish their importance or try and ignore some of the issues because it makes culture look less attractive. And Canada is certainly guilty of that too when it comes to trying to minimize the damage that we have done to the Native people for political reasons or for social reasons or cultural reasons. We do that, and that's something that I think needs to be corrected. So that is the end of the lecture. It's a pretty serious topic, I know, and I hope you learned something from it. We will move forward to the Gilded Age, which is from 1870 to 1900, and we will talk about the Westward Expansion and the again talk in more detail about the clash between the American settlers and the American people and the Native people of the Great Plains. Okay, so that is all for tonight. Thank you for listening, as always, and I will give you one more third lecture over the weekend to finish off this week. Okay, take care and enjoy your holiday. Good night.